Live from Quito, Ecuador, I'm Sony Gray and this is From the South, the daily news brief from Telesur English, and we start this new edition right now. The European Union has announced new sanctions against Venezuela, saying these were an expression of the bloc's concern over the political crisis in the country. The EU sanctions include a travel ban and an asset freeze on 7 senior Venezuelan officials, including some in charge of the security forces, who the Venezuelan opposition accused of abuses during the violent anti-government protests from last year. Venezuela's Minister of Communication and Information, Jorge Rodriguez, has emphasized that in spite of the EU sanctions, his government's focus is on democracy.
Vayan preparando más sanciones porque lo que viene son más elecciones.
They can start preparing more sanctions because what is coming is more elections, more democracy. In spite of the sanctions, in spite of the aggressions, in spite of the blockades, we will continue expressing our right to be free, sovereign, to be democratic, and we will enforce respect for our constitution.
A ser libres, a ser soberanos.
Bolivia's President Evo Morales spoke to the National Assembly to mark his 12th year in office. Our correspondent Freddy Morales sent this report from La Paz.
President Evo Morales has said that Bolivia overcame the curse of raw material exportation, beginning a 12-year program of successful industrialization. He highlighted that the economic success was due to the nationalization of the hydrocarbon industry. He pointed out the progress in the fight against racism and discrimination and advancing gender equality. The 12 years of Evo Morales' presidency is being celebrated amid an attempt by the opposition to try to prevent the president from running a new election in 2019. La Paz have enjoyed parades and celebrations with social sectors and indigenous people to mark the special occasion.
We thank Freddy Morales for that report. In Brazil, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva will find out this week if he will be allowed to run for president. Lula is in the lead to win October's presidential election if a court agrees he can run. Thousands of his supporters have been demonstrating in Porto Alegre, where the trial will take place. Meanwhile, the Network in Defense of Humanity has declared unrestricted support for Lula.
It's about 2,000 kilometers. Of course, it's worth it to walk all this way to defend democracy. What we are doing is very challenging, because an election without Lula is a fraud. We can't hold elections without Lula. He's a candidate who 4% of the Brazilian electorate intends to vote for. To exclude Lula is to exclude 40% of voters from the electoral process.
We start in Honduras, where one man has been killed and several other people have been arrested as the opposition began a week-long national strike. The opposition alliance called for the strike and demonstrations in protest against alleged fraud in the re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Riot police fired volleys of tear gas as protesters set tires on fire. One man could be seen fleeing the violence with his young son.
We demanded what we earned at the polls. Salvador president, and there was a mega fraud, and everyone saw it, and the Supreme Electoral Tribunal lent itself to that fraud.
The right belongs to us. They know they have not won anything. It's the people who won, and we will not stop demonstrating until he leaves.
The opposition strike in Honduras is expected to continue until January 27, when President Hernandez is due to be sworn in for another term. On Sunday, the Honduran Congress chose a speaker and a deputy speaker from the president's own national party, in spite of protests in the street outside.
This time, the protesters gather outside the parliament to push for a speaker and deputy speakers who represent the opposition. But the government got in first and installed its own majority.
They do things in a shady way. There was a meeting at 7 a.m., but they started it before, at 6:50 a.m., and before we knew it, they had everything settled.
If the opposition leaves the 61 members aligned with the dictatorship on their own, that's the number that the National Party go through fraud. It will be clear to the people of Honduras who's supporting their country's traitors.
It will be very difficult for the opposition to get a majority in Congress, because the government has political deals with most of the country's other parties.
The deals continue inside the Congress. It's the most anti-democratic institution in this country.
For these demonstrators, who came to put pressure on the government lawmakers and support the opposition, their fight must continue on behalf of the people.
We're going to keep fighting. We will continue fighting. We're not doing it just for one person. We're doing it for our people, who want justice, health, and housing.
As before, the protests turned violent. The military and the police fired tear gas. Persecution spread into residential areas around the Congress.
They came here into the Morazan neighborhood with tear gas. We had to take the children 8 blocks away to avoid them being affected by the gas.
One can't help but feel powerless because they have arms and we don't. But this government will fall. Sooner or later it will fall.
The protests will continue all week until Hernandez's inauguration on January 27th.
The president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, has described WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange as an inherited problem who has created trouble for his government. Assange was given asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London in 2012 by the former president Rafael Correa. Ecuador's foreign minister tried to obtain diplomatic status for Assange, but the British authorities had denied the request. The government said it was looking for a swift solution to this problem.
This action was taken by the foreign minister, and she gave us the explanation, including the requirements to obtain citizenship that Mr. Assange was fulfilling, and the possibility that he could, with diplomatic rank, be allowed to leave the embassy, and that would have solved our problem for good. We hope to have a positive result in the short term on this issue that has caused us more than a nuisance.
Ecuador's National Electoral Council has tested the vote counting system, which will be used during the February 4th referendum. The drill helped verify the scanning of the tally sheets, tested voting centers for people with disabilities, and established how information stands will work. A delegate from the National Electoral Council spoke about the release of the first results.
First results will be ready between 7 and 8 o'clock at night. A projection of the votes cast in 2,221 voting centers around the country for the 7 questions in the referendum. Having these first results doesn't mean we have definitive results. These first results will only be a projection, although they are always very close to the final results. The first results released by the National Electoral Council have almost never had big differences with the final results.
We take a short break now. Join us again after this short break and look at what our media colleagues are actually reporting.
Tensions are high amongst immigrants in the United States. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, are gearing up for a probable raid of 1,500 immigrants in the Bay Area. California declared itself a sanctuary for immigrants in 2018. The federal government responded by threatening to seize people in their communities. Sanctuary status prohibits local law enforcement from working with federal agents. While Obama deported a record number of people, under Trump, ICE raids have increased by 40%. Targets have been people with deep roots in the United States, like Ravi Ragbir. He's been in the U.S. since 1991, but because of a 2001 conviction, his status has been in limbo since, until he was snatched by ICE at a check-in meeting this month. He now sits in a detention center. And Jorge Garcia, also deported this month, married with 2 kids, deported to Mexico after 30 years in the U.S. He arrived at age 10 with an undocumented relative, unable to get legal status for years, even though his wife and kids are citizens. Aside from raids, legal protections are being dismantled. Temporary protected status has been revoked for Salvadorans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Sudanese immigrants, and the status of DACA remains unknown, as politicians in Washington continue to play games with people's lives.
Welcome back. China and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, are meeting in Chile for their first ministerial meeting to be held in South America. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and officials from 33 CELAC country members are set to promote new joint initiatives. China's focus will be the region's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative across the Pacific Ocean.
The Belt and Road Initiative proposed by China has attracted widespread attention among the Latin American countries. The Belt and Road Initiative is an innovation of China, which is in high accordance with the development of the times. We need broader connectivity, more investment in infrastructure, and more trade and investment. So the initiative is widely welcomed. Working together, the two sides can achieve mutually beneficial and win-win results in globalization.
Exports to China from Latin America and the Caribbean grew 23% in 2017. According to a CELAC report, it exceeds those to the rest of Asia, Europe, and the United States. China has also increased its investments in the region, opening greater possibilities for Chinese influence. China plans to construct a trans-Pacific fiber optic connection that will strengthen communication between countries. Residents of the island of Dominica are still trying to resume some semblance of a normal life after Hurricane Maria destroyed the island. So, the Dominican government has launched a special work program for those who lost their jobs, some over WhatsApp messages after the hurricane. That special work program aims to provide 1,100 jobs in the first instance.
The program should be transitional and operated for a period of 6 months in the first instance. The program itself should explore all job opportunities in the public sector and the private sector, including opportunities within the firms and agencies that may have made the very persons redundant purely based on its inability to pay.
And negotiations continue in Nicaragua to define the national minimum wage. In this report, we look at the negotiations between the government, the unions, and the private sector.
This is the second week in which the government, the unions, and the private companies are gathered to negotiate the country's minimum wage. The union's representative states that they are just listening to proposals.
We would like the increase to be substantial, because in our country, the minimum wage law establishes that with more inflation, more increase. That is not negotiable. That is a sure thing. What we need is to improve from that. Some entrepreneurs tell us that they would like to have a tripartite agreement, as the one of the maquila. We tell them we would accept that, as long as they give security to the 100% of the workers.
These tri-party agreements would give more workers to formal jobs under dignified contracts.
We will work to look for an agreement. That is our main goal.
The Ministry of Labor says there's been a 214% increase in the minimum wage over the last 10 years.
I think this is good. The minimum wage has been increased each year because there are always necessities in every home, and one must have expenses. You have a family. I find this positive.
Around 300,000 workers throughout the country currently work for minimum wage.
In Costa Rica, hundreds of people marched to demand a secular state. They are calling for the elimination of Catholicism as the official religion in the country. Several social movements, LGBTI organizations, and progressive parties protested in the middle of a political campaign deeply divided by conservatives. Protesters reject that the church receives state funding and tax exemptions. Costa Rica is the last Latin American country to define itself as a non-secular state in its constitution.
A lot of people say a non-secular state doesn't guarantee that the Catholic Church and other religions meddle in the decisions of the state, but it does guarantee that they don't take our money from our taxes so they can live like they do now, like millionaires.
A non-secular state is necessary because the state has to represent the rights of all people and defend them equally. We want tolerance, freedom of religion, a progressive country in all aspects, because it's a human right and it should be respected.
The Costa Rican government and the LGBTI community are celebrating a ruling by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in favor of rights for same-sex couples. Let's take a look at this story from our correspondent, Fernando Francia.
Activists of the LGBTI organization celebrated what they consider as a historic moment in the country. The government made a call for all the areas of the state to support the rights of the LGBTI community.
This means that the state, and I don't mean only the government in power, has the duty to guarantee all rights that come from a same-sex union, the same way it happens with any other family.
In a press conference, the government explained the response of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They believe that it needs to be implemented right away.
The decisions that are taken from now on will not only be decisions of the executive. They will be decisions that will be adopted in various sectors of the public sector.
From now on, these organizations will start the process to affirm respect for their rights.
I think this is a historic event. We are waiting for better things. We are waiting for our children lastly walk with their heads high as the citizens they are.
The LGBT community has claimed their rights for years now and think this is the moment the change will be effective.
In this moment, in Costa Rica, as well as in any other country of America, a couple of two men or two women may demand they want to marry.
They even have the first same-sex weddings planned.
This means that Costa Rica has the legal basis they needed to eliminate discrimination against the LGBTI community. It's not that we didn't have these rights before. We had them because they are inherent to the people. Nonetheless, the state didn't recognize them.
The organizations of trans people will ask for a change of name in their ID.
This is something to celebrate. It is huge progress in regard to human rights, especially for the trans people. The name change has been a major obstacle for our development.
In Costa Rica, there is still persecution to those who have protected the right for equality. Such is the case of Lali and Jasmine, that were married. But the notary who married them and validated their lawful union may be fired for considering them a family. They are hoping that from now on, their rights may finally be respected.
Thousands of people have been evacuated in Paraguay after a week of heavy rains and floods in different parts of Asunción. Our correspondent, Osvaldo Zayas, has more details in the next report.
I'm at
the Yucutlún neighborhood in Asunción. This is one of the most affected areas by the overflowing of the Paraguay River. About 18,000 people have been evacuated to refugee camps inside public institutions as a result of the floods. The Asunción municipality and the Secretary of Emergency have worked together in order to assist the victims. However, several communities and social organizations said they are not receiving emergency services and rescue missions don't have enough resources to evacuate many of the victims. This situation is affecting several districts with a total population of 100,000 people. The floods have forced families to leave their homes behind, and authorities are evaluating the possibility of declaring a state of emergency over the coming hours.
We thank Osvaldo for that report. At least 120 people have been evacuated from the city of Sayas Peña in the north of Argentina after heavy rains. More than 300 millimeters of rain flooded homes and streets. The flooding also damaged the drinking water supply system. Residents have been receiving help from local authorities and neighboring towns. Argentine President Mauricio Macri arrived in Moscow's Vnukovo airport on Monday on the first leg of his European tour. Macri was welcomed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov during his two-day visit. Macri will meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin as well as hold talks with Russian business leaders. Macri will leave Moscow and head to Switzerland for the World Economic Forum. We'll be back very soon, so stay with us. In the meantime, take a look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting on.
We face growing threats from revisionist powers as different as China and Russia are from each other.
Welcome back. As the wealthiest people on the planet prepare for the World Economic Forum in Davos, Oxfam has published a report calling for action to reduce the growing gap between the super rich and the rest of the world. This year's theme is creating a shared future in a fractured world. The 4-day event will have hundreds of sessions discussing global, regional, and industrial agendas. But critics, including Oxfam, have questioned the forum's vision of globalization. In their inequality report, Oxfam found that 4 out of every $5 of wealth generated in 2017 ended up in the pockets of the richest 1%, while the poorest half of the world's population actually got nothing.
Oxfam's inequality report this year reveals how our economies are rewarding wealth rather than the hard work of millions of people, ensuring that the few at the top get richer and richer, and the millions at the bottom are trapped in poverty wages. We found that last year, 82% of the total wealth created was captured by the top 1%. And the bottom 50% of the world, 3.7 billion people, got nothing, 0% of that new wealth.
Hundreds of thousands of protesters have taken part in the second annual women's rights demonstrations held around the world, coincided with President Trump's inauguration anniversary.
In addition to a march on the White House, 250 cities and towns participated in the U.S. as did numerous cities across Europe and Australia, under the name Power to the Polls. Organizers are hoping to encourage more women to get involved in politics at the local and national level. New York's Persist and Resist rally saw a massive turnout.
We want you to get out and vote. And in 2018, we have a goal of registering 1 million women to vote and getting them to the polls in November!
Las Vegas, Oregon, and other cities nationwide saw women taking to the streets with banners and demands for a more equal society and a president who respects both women and men. Hundreds in Berlin marched through the city in solidarity with women around the world. Organized by the Democrats Abroad Germany Association, local activists made speeches at the city's Brandenburger Gate.
We're being excluded when we speak a truth that is Ahad's truth, a truth that is our truth. Why is it our truth? Because here where we're standing now, we know that there could be very well a government who openly goes against us as immigrants, as Muslims, as women, as LGBTIQ, okay?
In London, protesters marched on Downing Street to decry any support to the US president and to call for an end to sexual violence under the banner Time's Up.
Having equal pay, that's a huge thing that we're still fighting for. There's so many women who say, I'm actually leaving my job because of this, and that shouldn't be happening. They should be giving women more pay.
Hundreds of women joined the rallies in France, marching in the rain to the Eiffel Tower, in Paris, where they chanted slogans and called for more progress across the women's rights movement.
Donald Trump is just a symptom. He is not the problem. As the speakers were saying, he is only saying out loud what is being enacted every day. Violence against minorities, against women, against indigenous populations, the LGBTQ community, basically anyone that's not a white man. And that it's important that we stand up to that and we fight that no matter how we can. And today is the day that we can come together and let each other know that you're not alone. We're all fighting in this together.
As anti-Trump sentiment grows around the world and the feminist movement simultaneously pushes its equality agenda forward, the next year is likely to see continued clashes between those who support human rights and the president's agendas.
Opposition olive branch is in its third day. Turkish artillery and warplanes have pounded hundreds of sites around border towns in northern Syria. Turkish ground troops are pushing an offensive against Kurdish militia in regions where Turkey says they are strongholds of People's Protection Units, or YPGs. Heavy rocket and missile bombardment of the border regions is still underway, despite condemnation by Syria, Russia, and France. Israeli Arab Parliament members have disrupted U.S. Vice President Mike Pence's speech at the Israeli Parliament on Monday. Pence affirmed for the crowd that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and that the U.S. Embassy would be moved there before the end of 2019. The protesting Parliament members, who held up signs in Arabic and English reading "Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine," before being forced out of the room.
We protested, a political and parliamentary protest, against the policy of the White House, of President Trump, of Vice President Pence, and we lifted a photo saying that East Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. It's a political position, and not all of those who were in the Knesset supported Pence and his Messiah policy. We, the third party in the Knesset, said no to Trump, no to Pence, and we will continue to demand Israeli-Palestinian peace based on putting an end to occupation and East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine.
Iconic Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein has been celebrated on what would have been his 120th birthday. Eisenstein became known for his video montage technique based on building scenes from different parts of film reels. He crafted a new visual language of screen storytelling that continues to influence directors today. We've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website, telusyourtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I am Sweeney Gray. Thank you so much for watching.